how is it that your psoas and jaw can combine to create postural instability and musculoskeletal pain and a lot of other horrible symptoms? Well, it's through the autonomic nervous system, and these connections is what this video is about. Before I get into the details, here is the big picture. Ventral vagal dysfunction. Just think of front of the face, the mouth, your tongue, your larynx, your vagus nerve, your visual system, your auditory system, all of that. When something goes wrong inside there, that ventral vagal system, it increases sympathetic trunk activity, which is your torso, which means increased sympathetic trunk creates extension. Extension of the lower back will tilt the pelvis forward on one, which is what we call the left AIC pattern as defined by the Postural Restoration Institute, or both, which is called the bilateral AIC pattern or PEC pattern. So that means that increased sympathetic activity, trunk activity, increases hip flexor overactivity, hypertonicity. So your hip flexors get overactive and your lower back gets overactive, which holds you in this state of extension. Now, the big question comes, how is it from the cranium and the jaw? Well, now I'm going to delve into the details. This young man has a rib cage that is extended, he's overarched, and thus he cannot pass his shoulder internal rotation tests. He also has a pelvis that is forward on both sides, actually. I only show two tests. I only show the left arm and the left leg, but his pelvis is forward on both sides. He's in sympathetic extension toned overactivity. The only way he's going to pass this test, because I know his jaw, he has a TMJ issue. His jaw was not positioned properly. It was off to the right. The only way he's going to pass this test is by taking a little plastic mouth guard and putting it over his bottom teeth. So the moment his brain senses something different between his teeth, the sympathetic nervous system overactivity immediately decreases. The sympathetic trunk extension activity goes away, his pelvic tilt goes away, and he can now pass his shoulder and his leg test, and that's what you're going to see. So his left shoulder does not internally rotate. His left leg does not adduct, it doesn't go down. He's extended. Now he's going to put a little plastic mouth guard in over his bottom teeth, and immediately, he can adduct, his hip flexors turned off, and his back extensors and the front of his neck also relaxed. Why was he stuck in this sympathetic fight or flight type of situation? Well, it was coming from his jaw. His jaw was off to the right, and I know that's a big problem. And you'll see in later on in the video pictures of me. I was in the exact same situation. When that jaw is off to the right, that body, that neck is influenced into a state of tension. It pulls the head and neck forward, extends the rest of the body, and now you're stuck in this sympathetic trunk activity. So his ventral vagal dysfunction, which was coming from a jaw that was not positioned properly, that his own brain was sensing as a threat, that ventral vagal dysfunction was fight or flight and extension tone. It promoted fight or flight extension tone, which then increased sympathetic trunk activity, which then created disordered breathing, neck breathing. He's still in fight or flight. So you get stuck in this triangle of tension and sympathetic activity that just feeds off itself. The moment that little tongue, well, this is a real mouth guard, an acrylic one. The moment that went over the bottom teeth, it was like a circuit breaker. The whole system just relaxed because the only reason he was in that state was because of his jaw, his TMJ, his temporomandibular joint. So first you have to understand the autonomic nervous system, because that's the player. His body, and anyone with this type of issue, their body is being held hostage by the sympathetic fight or flight system. So the ventral vagal system, it's a better way of explaining the fight or flight phenomenon. Basically, the trigeminal nerve, that's the mouth. The facial nerve, self-explanatory. But the trigeminal and facial also influence the hearing muscles of your ear. The glossopharyngeal, so the back of your throat and the back of your tongue, your ability to swallow. All these are very important things. The vagus nerve. Who doesn't know the vagus nerve at this point? That's the major parasympathetic, the rest and digest nerve. And then the accessory nerve, which is really interesting, and we'll get to that separately. The accessory nerve is the 11th cranial nerve, and it controls your SCMs and your upper and your trapezius muscles, which allow your head to turn and rotate so your brain can figure out where you are in space. So taken all together, the ventral vagal system controls or is responsible for orientation. Where am I in space? Remember, you might see where you are in space, but your brainstem, the part of the brain that's trying to figure out all of this, trying to integrate all of this sensory input so it can figure out where you are, does not know where you are. It does not, it's weird to think about, but your brain has to figure out where your body is, what your body is doing. From the great book, How Emotions Are Made, she says, from the point of view of your brain, your body is just another external source of information that it has to figure out. What you're feeling, what you're sensing, whether that rumble in your stomach is because of appetite or nerves, they're very similar. So your brain's constantly trying to figure out what your body is doing internally, and then how your brain and body are relating to the external world. So orientation, your environment. Orientation, where am I? Where's the ground? Where's visual space? Where's that car? Where's that tree? Where's that guy about to hit me? Communication, humans, we communicate. More language, all comes from the front of the face and obviously the body. And feeding, swallowing, eating. All of life happens with this ventral vagal system. And whenever something goes wrong in that ventral vagal system, like TMD, temporomandibular dysfunction, because of a TMJ that's not positioned properly, however that occurred, or teeth that have been pulled, especially molars and canines, whenever that happens, that's threat. And once your brain is threatened, it promotes extension, fight or flight. This is what the cranial nerves look like. There's a lot of them. And they all go into the midbrain and the brainstem, which is the autonomic regulator. So your fight or flight, whether you're in fight or flight or whether you're rested and digested, is happening at that midbrain and brainstem. And that's all ventral vagal system, all the information your brain is collecting, whether you're in a threatening environment or not, or you're in a peaceful environment. That all goes back to that midbrain brainstem area, which then regulates your heartbeat, regulates your breathing, prepares you for fight or flight. Now, again, you see all these nerves, and those are not just the cranial nerves, those are also, we'll get to them, the brachial plexus, the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus. We'll get to that. But what I do show is the upper trapezius and the SCM, the sternocleidomastoids. Whenever you're threatened, and that's part of the ventral vagal system. So whenever this ventral front area is threatened by the situation you're in, a tooth that got taken out, a jaw that deviated, your own voice got a little bit thrown off, you can't swallow anymore, you had a throat injury, that ventral vagal system is threatened. And when that happens, the SCM and the upper traps pull your head and neck forward into a forward head position. And then simply that promotes neck breathing. And neck breathing, that's disordered breathing. Neck breathing is fight or flight activity. And it doesn't even have to be something, an insult to the front of the head or the face or something. It could be you sat too much. You sit in a chair too much. You're too stationary. You sit and stare at computer screens. That's all ventral vagal. Head and neck fall forward and you hyperfocus your eyes. That is the autonomic nervous system. So, not everyone who ends up in this consistent state of tension and fight or flight has anything wrong with the oral cavity. Just because your hip flexors are tight doesn't mean it's coming from up here. It could just be a forward head posture that's putting you into increased sympathetics, which then increase the hip flexor activity. So once that head and neck fall forward, for any reason, whether it's something with your mouth or not, or just too much sitting and too much neck breathing, your spinal sympathetic chain, which is going from the top of your spine, from T1 all the way down to L2, which is the lumbar spine, which would be right about here-ish. L1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the sacrum. All right. Those are the fight or flight muscles. Think back extensors and hip flexors. So yeah, the moment your cranium or the mouth, the TMJ, because that's the discussion we're having right now, once that's threatening and your brain says, whoa, that's not good, that sympathetic nervous system kicks in, you extend, your rib cage goes up, your pelvis falls forward, and now you have back extensors, lower back muscles, and hip flexors that won't shut off. And those are pelvic destabilizers. And now once your pelvis stays unstable because your brain is saying, no, this is a threatening situation, you lose stability in your pelvis, you lose your hamstrings, your glutes, and your pelvic floor, and I'm going to show that. And now, again, you just get stuck in this loop of disordered breathing, tension, and then eventually you develop an unstable pelvis, which creates even more of this fight or flight tension behaviors. Real quick, if you like this video, you think it's interesting, could you share it, subscribe, comment, give it a thumbs up, anything to promote this, because a lot of people are still in the dark about these situations. Now this sympathetic trunk, you can see it all in the front of your spine, and you can see how it really starts all the way up here and starts to drop all the way down. That's the sympathetic chain. It also is regulating heart, lungs, organs, gut, genitals. So your sexual function as a male or female will be greatly impacted by the sympathetic trunk. If your head and neck fall forward, let's say because of TMJ, a jaw that's not positioned properly, your brain finds it threatening, or simply the jaw is not positioned properly and the neck muscles are now not positioned properly, you go into extension, you get shifted over to your right side, because remember, we know that bigger right diaphragm is underlying everything, so we're all right dominant. We go to that right side, we extend, and now that sympathetic trunk is overactive. Your vagus nerve never gets to calm everything down. It never gets to exert its influence. The more sympathetic you are, the more your vagus nerve recedes its activity, but it's the vagus nerve activity that keeps things calm. So the way fight or flight works is you're happy, you're in a parasympathetic state, you're in your car, you're singing your favorite song, you're nice and relaxed, your vagus nerve is firing, everything's cool. Someone cuts you off, and all of a sudden you go, whoa, what the F? That's sympathetics. Once that occurs, the vagus nerve withdraws its tone, its influence, and your sympathetics come into full blast because you were threatened. Now, once that situation ends, you're like, what a jerk, but he speeds away and you get back to your song, that's when the vagus nerve should start to exert its influence again and start to calm everything down. But when you're in a forward head posture and you have pelvic instability at this point, and you're neck breathing, and your brain is saying, oh, that missing tooth is a real problem. I need that molar back because I can't sense where my head and teeth are or where my jaw is going. Then the vagus nerve never gets to reassert its calming influence, and that's the problem. That's how you get stuck in that cycle of tension. The vagus nerve simply doesn't get to re-exert its calming influence. So it's not about treating the vagus nerve, it's not about treating the vagus nerve, or it's about what's feeding into the dysfunction that the vagus nerve is not allowed to exert its calming influence. Now, some people do know about this. Not a lot, unfortunately, but there are. And in fact, this little passage here comes from this book, Face to Face with the Face. That's what this is all about. I think they're in England, actually. Thomas Atley, yeah, he's in London. I don't know how old it is, but so this is known. Cranial sacral therapists know this. This dentist works with cranial sacral therapists to try to deal with this interconnectedness. So just see what he writes. He says, the teeth and jaw are an integral part of the rest of the body. If they are treated in isolation without awareness of that interconnection, then the benefits may be limited and the effects potentially disruptive. An uneven bite or malocclusion may lead to unbalanced muscle use, jaw muscles, throat muscles, neck muscles, with dominoes through the rest of the body. And you can have all these types of compression of the jugular foramen, impinging the jugular vein, the spinal accessory nerve, the vagus nerve, headaches, ear pain, tinnitus, respiratory, cardiac, digestive disturb, all of it. They know this. I know this. I've experienced it myself. Postural restoration knows this. This is what we deal with all the time. But it goes further than that. It doesn't stop here. It goes all the way down to the pelvis, all the way to the ground. And that's what's so fascinating. This is a vestibular system input, an upright balance issue. How your brain orients, how your brain figures out where you are in space, how it moves you forward is all influenced by the head and the jaw and the teeth, as he's saying. So the problem with extension is, in terms of movement, your ability to move forward without restriction, you need hip flexors that can alternate between being on and off. That psoas has to turn on and off to help move the pelvis forward, to help rotate your body to the opposite side, and to help turn the leg out. But really, who cares about the biomechanics? The biomechanics can't work unless your body is in a more or a non-heightened sympathetic state. All movement is sympathetic. So it's not like you're not moving in a rest and digest parasympathetic state, but it's not an all or not. You're not either in sympathetic or in parasympathetic. It's kind of described like that quite often, but it's not. There's a ratio of everything. It wouldn't even make sense. So, but your hip flexors have to go through cycles of on and off on alternating sides so that the pelvis can move forward and the spine can rotate. Otherwise, you can't move. Otherwise, you're extended. So if both sides of the pelvis come forward at the same time, you can only do one thing: extend. You can't move. You're going to move forward, but with strain. And eventually, it's going to start to hurt and break your body down. So the problem is when you're extended, the somatic system, like, hey, you're goal-directed, I want to do this, I reach for this. You'll still reach, but because of the extension, the tension, and the limited movement of your body, you're going to strain to do it, and over time, you're going to start to use the wrong muscles to do it. And that's what starts to hurt. Very normally, the right arm, once you're in this position for too long, you're extended for too long in this pattern, your neck really starts to take over the right arm. You're not going to be using your serratus muscles and your lower trapezius and your tricep and your bicep. They're not going to be, because your scapula is not going to be positioned properly. So the neck and your lat will start to take over the use of the right arm. So, your cervical plexus, these are the muscles of the neck and diaphragms. It's all up through here. Those muscles, and you're going to see a picture of them, those nerves control all these muscles. Well, once that head and neck come forward, you could very easily, first of all, you're going into extension as you do it, but you could get compression in any of those nerves. Those nerves may not fire optimally. So, there's a lot in that area. There's no open space. So that could be affected. That could be thoracic outlet syndrome type of symptoms. Then you have the brachial plexus, which C5 to T1, so it's mid-neck down to the top thoracic vertebrae. Muscles of the shoulders and arms. So here's a picture of that. Shoulders, upper arms, lower arms, and hands. I mean, it's on both sides. Just one side is maroon, the other one is yellow. But there's a ton. Look at how many of those nerves go through between the collarbone and the rib cage underneath. The moment that head and neck come forward and you extend, that space gets smaller. So in postural restoration, we're always trying to expand the rib cage with air to clear up space so those nerves, conduction and function, can go back to being normal. The sacral plexus, so the L4 to S4, so your lower lumbar spine, it's your lower lumbar spine, and to the sacrum area, pelvic floor, glutes, hamstrings, lower legs, and feet. Those are pelvic stabilizers. When you're in the state of extension and your thorax is in that extended fight or flight state, and your hip flexors are on, and your lower back muscles are on constantly, you lose the ability to use your pelvic floor to breathe with your diaphragm. So you can no longer diaphragmatically breathe. You lose your glutes, you lose your hamstrings. And those muscles are needed to work with the hip flexors, because the hip flexors are not bad, they just need to be used appropriately. But hip flexors need glutes and hamstrings to be able to alternate you from side to side. So if I'm taking a step and I want to swing my right leg forward, I'll use my right hip flexor to swing that leg forward as my pelvis is turning to the left, as that left hamstring and left glute are stabilizing that left side. And then you do the opposite. So you have to have alternating cycles of hip flexor and hamstring, glute, pelvic floor activity. But if you're stuck in a state of extension on one or both sides because of extension tone being driven by the jaw or anything, or just disordered breathing, doesn't matter, that is compromised, and now the pelvic becomes, those pelvic stabilizers no longer work properly. They'll work to a degree, but not the way they're supposed to. And now you become less stable in your pelvis because your hip flexors have taken over. And remember, pelvic nonstop or overactive hip flexors are pelvic destabilizers. So your pelvic stabilizers don't get to activate. So the gentleman in the video, his hip flexors were so overactive because of his jaw, he could not feel his hamstrings or his glutes in any type of postural restoration activity. And here you just have an image of that sacral plexus. That sciatic nerve is gigantic. Okay, so anytime that pelvis is forward on both sides and those legs have to externally rotate on one or both sides to compensate for the pelvis that's forward, that sciatic nerve could be impinged. And a lot of people have sciatic pain. It's really not that hard to figure out, to be honest. It's the pattern that we're talking about, extension. Okay, so now that we have the nuts and bolts of the position and the limitations, what does this mean for you and your brain and movement? Well, from the brain from the inside out by Georgi, I don't know how to pronounce it, Busaki. I mentioned it one time previously and I didn't mention it properly, and obviously someone from a Hungarian individual kind of scolded me for not saying it properly. So I don't know how to say it. But anyway, he's a genius and he has a lot of great neuroscience books. That's the thing. You can't think like a physical therapist. When it comes to this type of stuff, you have to think about neurology, about neuroscience. It's about the brain much more than it is about the physical body. So here it is. The brain's experience of movement. Your brain has to experience movement to understand where you are. When you sit too much, all of this that I'm about to read goes away because you're not moving. Your brain loses sense of where you are. You're in a non-gravitational state. You're sitting. Gravity is not pushing you into the ground. It's pushing you to the seat, but your feet are not necessarily sensed on the ground like they would be if you're standing or squatting. So sitting in chairs and staring at computer screens takes away everything I'm just about to read. So your vestibular upright balance sensors, your inner ears, detect changes in acceleration, in velocity. That means your balance system, your balance centers of your brain needs movement to understand where you are, needs to be upright to understand where you are. The head direction system, neck rotation, for your head to rotate and for your brain to understand where you're headed. You have vast neural networks. It's fascinating. Read the book Dark and Distant Places. It's called The Neuroscience of Navigation. That's what that's about. Your brain has vast networks spread throughout all regions of the brain, not just one region. It's a network of cells devoted to only one thing. Where is my head located? It's freaking fascinating. But at any rate, the head direction system relies on rotation. If your neck doesn't rotate, that whole system falls apart. Extended bodies and extended necks can't rotate. So if you're an extension, you can't navigate. Your brain can't figure out where you are in space. Everything is altered. Motion, third line, motion by your brain is directly experienced from vision, optic flow, vision, your visual system. It has to understand and pay attention to space passing you by, the environment passing you by as you're going through it. That's how it's figuring out where you are in space. That's why monovision and that's why progressive glasses are so bad, because they take away your peripheral flow. You cannot get anything. These people are tight when they're wearing either of those types of glasses. And tactile flow. Tactile would be the sense of your feet, your heel, arch, big toe hitting the ground. And the feel of tactile flow could be your own hip joints compressing and decompressing as you move forward. So once you're too extended for too long, especially if that head and neck really do come forward and you're stuck and you're locked up through the jaw, all of this kind of breaks down. You're still going to move, and it's all these circuits overlap, so it's not like there's a lot of redundancy in these systems, but the pain and the tension that you may feel is coming because of this slide. This is the big picture. All you got to do is get out of extension, get the head and neck back into their normal position. This is what postural restoration does. It restores normal position of the pelvis, the rib cage, the spine, the neck, and the head through normal postural restoration activities. You're going to need to find someone. I mean, it's complicated, but that's what it's designed to do. So this can start to work again. So your brain can figure out, where am I? And then the tension can drop. Oh, here it is. Dark and Magical Places, the Neuroscience of Navigation. Basically, if you disrupt the vestibular system, you disrupt the head direction signal. A rat can no longer navigate as accurately if its vestibular system is damaged, and neither can a human. So anything that's influencing the vestibular system, anything neck, is because of neck rotation. So if a jaw is mispositioned or too far back and the airway is compressed and you can't diaphragmatically breathe and you're stuck in a state of extension, that's all influencing your ability for your head and neck to rotate and your torso to rotate and your pelvis to rotate without restriction. So all those vestibular signals are being diminished, and now your brain gets a little bit threatened, and again you stay in this cycle of tension. And here you go. This is from a book about the vestibular system. When you lose sense of the ground, which happens when you're extended because you can't go from side to side appropriately, so your feet can't go through a cycle of heel, arch, big toe, your brain does not sense the ground appropriately. And don't even get me on minimalist shoes. They will not help the situation. I've already made videos about that. But what happens when the floor is moved from underneath an individual? They're going to use extension, and that's what this graph is showing. The tibialis, the quads, the gastrocs, the SCM, the neck, the traps, and the paravertebrals, your lower back muscles. It does say abdominals and hamstrings, but I can tell you in that position that you see that figure in, that is lengthening. That's not concentric. That's not the way the abdominals and hamstrings are they're being used in an extended position. Let's just put it that way. So that can be a little bit misleading because you might say, hey, but I know about PRI and we want hamstrings and abdominals. You do. Or actually, I don't even, is that abdominals or abductors? Quadriceps, gastrocs, back muscles? Abdominals, yeah. But they're in a lengthened position because you're extending. That figure is extending. They're lengthened. They're not being used the way that nature intended. So a lot of people are in disbelief about the brain sense of the ground and how a jaw position could influence your brain sense of the ground. I got a lot of nasty comments on a video a year ago that reached 1 million viewers, and that's why I'm revisiting the subject. A lot of most comments were positive, but some were very nasty and they just don't get it. But here it is. The association between masticatory muscle activation and foot pressure distribution in older female adults. It doesn't matter who they were. This is the way it works. You bring your teeth together on the right, your body shifts to the right. You bring your teeth together on the left, in the molar area, body shifts to the left. That's what they found in the study. Read it. You can look it up, but that's what it says. When people have jaws that are mispositioned, or they have missing teeth, or the jaw's too far back, whatever it is, that ventral vagal system is dysregulated through the oral cavity. That's why sometimes these splints are made to restore normal sense of the mouth. So when I bring my teeth together on the right, I can go right. When I go left, I go left. When a jaw is mispositioned, that's not going to happen. You're going to have a crossbite situation. Your brain gets confused. So just like you should be able to put one foot down and pick the other foot up, you should be able to bring one side of your mouth together and not feel the other side. When you can alternate sides of the mouth, your body is free, your neck is free, your torso is free. But once the jaw is mispositioned, or any type of malocclusion, anything going on in the mouth, and you can't separate those sides, you can't shift from side to side. End of story. I mean, you'll shift, but not appropriately. You're going to do it through strain. You're going to do it through compensation. So this is why we use those splints, to harmonize the mouth, particularly in the back, with the ground underneath your heels. More so on the left than the right, but either way, you need them both sides. This is me from my late 20s or early 30s, I can't remember. But that image is from this book. That's a cranial strain pattern. That jaw is over to the right. That head is collapsing on the right. And I am that figure. That is a cranial, it's not a good one. It's a bad cranial strain. No, I mean, no strain pattern in your cranium is good. But this is a very bad one, let's put it that way. You can see my right canine is displaced because my jaw had shifted so far to the right. Everything got pushed out. So I got stuck over on my right side, but I was there from a very, very young age. So I had vestibular, navigation, upright activity dysfunction. I was all extended. I was all back and quads and neck. And that's how I got through life. And it was painful. And that's what led to the chronic pain. I don't have pain anymore. I still have ring in my ears, but it's way better than it used to be. But I'm pain-free. So postural restoration, that's all I did. If you're wondering, I know I get the comments, well, what do I do to fix this? Postural restoration. Postural Restoration Institute, that's what I do. That's what I practice. That's what helped me. I did nothing else. I did need dental intervention through a splint and an optometrist who understood what I was talking about my vision. But I was in this situation. When you look at my face, when that jaw shifted and my head literally collapsing, and you can see a picture, a difference between my old head and my new head. Here's a comparison from just 2017. I was in that pattern. My head was still collapsing to the right. My jaw was still to the right. And that was better than it used to be. But now you can see me in 2024. My head is much more upright. Everything has rearranged. That was all this. My brain is finally figuring out where I am in space. My neck is free to move. I can rotate. My head direction system can figure out where my head is in relation to the environment. I can navigate without problems. I was in Chicago a couple weeks ago. I walked 8 miles a day, no pain. That would not have happened the last time I was in Chicago, which was right around 2017. I was in so much pain, it was misery. So to sum this all up and bring it to a close, if you have TMJ, TMD, temporomandibular dysfunction, if you have a visual system that's a little wonky, like you have one eye that looks, you have a big difference between your two eyes, you have a missing molar, you have hearing loss, significant hearing loss can influence your cranium, your cranial nerves, your autonomic nervous system. So anytime there's oral cavity or cranial dysfunction, that will facilitate that spinal sympathetic extension chain, fight or flight, pelvic destabilizers, hip flexors and back extensors, and then that area inhibits your ability to stabilize with your pelvic floor, your glutes, your hamstrings, your lower leg, and your foot, which are the pelvic stabilizers. So cranium dysfunction, anything in here, ventral vagal system, if it's dysfunctional over time, it's not all or nothing. Some people have something going on and they're not in a lot of pain. Some people are in significant amounts of pain. They can have really weird symptoms like my tinnitus. They can have, they get very off balance very quickly. They get very lightheaded, things like that. That facilitates extension, fight or flight. And as extension and fight or flight go on longer and longer, it inhibits or takes away your ability to stabilize your pelvis with your pelvic floor muscles, glutes, hamstrings, lower legs, and then your feet can't go through their normal cycles. And then the brain gets lost with the ground. And it just becomes that circle of death, so to speak.